Many of us, when we go to bed and try to go to sleep at night, we think about a lot of things. One of the things that we at least occasionally think about is, who is God? We ask ourselves all kinds of questions about who God is, what He does, whether He loves us really, and what else could we do to gain God's favor? People have not always pondered this so seriously. Many, many years ago, when the primitive people first came into the world, they were usually too busy hunting and gathering and trying to fashion a life for themselves as best they could in sometimes difficult circumstances. In those many years, thousands and thousands of years, there really were no gods. It was not something that they contemplated. They simply went on about their lives as best they could. What they did know, as we know, is that we did not create this world. We did not create this universe. And so over a long, long time, that idea and that reality became the basis for having gods. And so in the ancient era, there were three main Western groups that had gods. There were the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Each of them had their own sets of gods with different names and different functions. The Egyptian culture lasted for perhaps as long as 5,000 years, and they may have had as many as 1,000 gods, each with their own name and their own purpose and their own function. And the Greeks and the Romans continued this, not quite on the same scale, but each of the gods had a purpose. And the main thing that people did was they tried to appease or please the gods, particularly in terms of weather and the annual harvest. And they would have sacrifices and they would have festivals, all designed to appease the gods in their favor. And so it's in this polytheism or multi-god culture that the Jews themselves began a most radical distinction based on their sense that God had told to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and generations of Jews after them, that there really was only one God whom they came to call Yahweh. And that this God, unlike all the earlier gods, would be somebody who would influence their lives on a very personal, daily basis, that prayer and sacrifices and laws and culture would come together, and that the Jews simply felt that God was the most important being in their lives, which is still true today. They had, in the ancient culture, 613 different laws, some of them dietary, some of them about sacrifices and how those were to be done, and many other activities that were governed by these laws. And the religion and the culture focused around how these laws and rules could appease God. It was a kind of different version, but a more personal version of what the earlier cultures had done. And this went on for perhaps as long as 1,000 years, maybe longer, before Jesus came along 2,000 years ago. Many times people will ask, well, why did Jesus come when he did? Was there something about the time period or the time frame at which he arrived that seemed important? Well, as some of you know, there's a Jewish festival and holiday called Hanukkah. Hanukkah comes from a period in the 2nd century BC called the Maccabean Revolt. This is where the menorah, the seven-sided candelabra comes from. And it came out of the Maccabean Revolt because the Jews, for a period of time, were able to gain some freedom against their oppressive regimes that often ruled them throughout the centuries. Later on, King Herod the Great helped to rebuild the temple, and then he died in 4 BC. Jesus was born around that time, after Herod died. And so what Jesus was able to do he was able, among many other things, he was able to have the Jews consider not the necessity of their laws and their practices, but whether there was something beyond their laws and practices that needed to be addressed. And so when you read the Gospels, what he's often talking about amongst his Jewish brethren, particularly the religious figures, is in essence asking them, is this all we have? This religion of ours? Is there something more we need to be doing? And so what Jesus was able to do for the first time was to introduce what I would call the divine-human chasm, which means, what is the difference between what is human and what is divine? He is the one and only person, the one and only being who straddles this chasm. He has elements of both. In the traditional Christian theology, he is fully human and fully divine. Now, I myself don't quite buy that at that level, but I understand what they're talking about. I would consider him to be a human who is transfused with the divine, but he is not an independent divine being on his own, as is taught in the Trinity, because he dies. And divine beings don't die. And so one of the things that happens to us, those of us who believe in God, is we always want to know more about him. And the frustration and the difficulty is that all of us know is God is and is always invisible. Now, this is so simple that we don't even think about it. Everybody knows this, and we kind of take it for granted, but it presents a very perplexing frustration. What do you do with a being who is constantly invisible? You will never see him. You will never hear him. I don't know if he ever actually talks to us in the way that we talk to each other. I know people say that God talks to them, and I don't deny that that's possible, but I'm not sure it's like how we talk to each other. And certainly it's pretty rare. And so when we go to bed at night and we conjure God, that is what we're doing. We're conjuring him because he's invisible. And so when people pray at bedtime, they form some sort of an image or a picture as to what it is he might look like that they're praying to. Now, if any of you are atheists, you would say this is the silliest thing in the world. How do you talk to somebody who's invisible, that you can't see and you can't hear, you won't touch, who may never speak to you in your entire life? And in a certain sense, they're right. Because even if we all go to heaven, we may never meet God in the sense that we know it's him. He will give us intimations of himself. We will know it's him because we know it's not one of us. But I'm still not sure we're going to talk to him in the usual sense of the word. I don't know if God talks to people in the usual sense that we think of. You will remember from the Old Testament that Moses wanted to see the face of God, just to have a sense of what he looked like. And God said, no, you don't get that. You're human and I'm divine, and that's the way it is. And so, what Jesus represents to we Christians is an approximation, both in terms of the physicality of him having a human body and an approximation of God's spirituality because of what he's capable of doing. Namely, he's capable of, at times, performing miracles. And for most of us, that is what we get. So you might ask yourself, well, who is God and what does he do? So I'm going to give you my sense of who he is. My sense, like most people's, is that God has always existed. That he wasn't born as we are. That there wasn't a time when there was no God. We can't know if there was always a universe, but it seems likely that there's always been a God. Another thing we know about God is he grants us free will. He lets us do many things on our own. He lets us live our lives. He lets us make things. He lets us go places. He lets us have jobs. He lets us love people. And everything else that we do. And he never restrains us from any of that. He never comes and whispers in our ear at night and he doesn't say, don't do that. That's a big mistake you're going to make. He lets us make mistakes. He lets us sin. He lets us transgress against his will. And so it would be easy to say, well, if that's the way it is with him, what good is he? Because he doesn't stop us from being, for example, self-destructive. He doesn't keep us from becoming drug addicts or criminals. Because what he wants us to do is to find him. And if we have no free will, we can't find him. The other animals and creatures in the world, they can't find him. So he's ours. And we're his. And so that leads to the old question of, why does God let us suffer? Why does God let us have terminal illnesses? Why does God let our children die while we still live? Because that's his world. He doesn't save us from ourselves much of the time. That's the frustration. Everybody wants him to come and swoop in and make things right. And most of the time, he doesn't. He doesn't keep people alive who are going to die. He doesn't save us from being self-destructive. He doesn't save us from making mistakes. And so it would be easy to say, well, what good is he? And I guess my answer to that is that he gave us the world. He gave us a chance to live. And to a large measure, he says, well, it's up to you now. I've given you the ability to take care of yourselves. I've given you a world to feed you. What are you going to do with it? One thing that God does not do in this same vein is, I don't think he controls the weather. I know people pray for rain. I pray for rain sometimes, especially as it is now in the summer when it's hot. Because he could make it rain if he wanted to. That doesn't mean it's going to rain. I don't think God makes hurricanes that come and smash up houses in Florida. I don't think he does that on purpose. I don't think he creates earthquakes or tornadoes just to destroy people's lives and kill them. So in the same way, if somebody is spared from such calamity in a tornado, that's not God's will either. They're just lucky. You can't have it both ways. And so, related to all this is the subject of evolution. Did God create the means for evolution, or is the Genesis description in the Old Testament of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden more likely? I think the Garden of Eden story is the ancient Jews' description of a kind of evolution. It's their way of trying to make sense of how the world began. It's a mythical story, which doesn't mean it's false. Mythical means, how do you understand something? How do you make sense of it? And so they're trying to make sense of both the creation of the world, the creation of men and women, and free will, sin, and redemption, all in a story at the same time. So, evolution is what he sets in motion. And then it, as in the Darwinian sense, it kind of expands and takes care of itself over millions and millions of years. So I don't think there's an opposition to God and evolution. Does he micromanage every bit of it? No. It's hard to understand how it would happen without him, though, because it's too intelligent. The last thing I want to talk about who is God, is on the occasions where he does intervene in people's lives. And you know that's who it is because there is no other explanation for it. See, I think when God intervenes, you don't have to figure it out. You don't have to ask yourself, is this really him? Because it is him. Because there is no other explanation for it. The most common version of this is what we call medical miracles, where somebody is sick in the hospital and the doctors have done whatever they can do, and it's likely the person's going to die. The family meets together with the doctor. He or she tells them that the outcome is not good, and they start praying, usually as a group. And the prayers they make to God are the best kind of prayers. They're urgent, they're sincere, and they're what in Old Testament language is called beseeching, which means, please help us now. And that seems to be what happens when medical miracles happen, is that God is talked to in an urgent, sincere manner. And in that sense, we could say God has an ego. God has a sense that out of all what people are saying and doing on a given day, this group of very worried, upset people, calls upon him to do what seems to be impossible. And he does. He heals those who are about to die. There are cases of this with medical confirmation between the before and the after that are inexplicable to any doctor. And they'll tell you this. They'll tell you it wasn't me that did it, that healed this person. So it's not even a question. So who is God? God is a person that varies all the way from I can't find him, he won't listen to me, he won't answer my prayers, I don't know where he is or what he looks like, all the way from that to somebody who comes out of the hospital miraculously healed. I hope this has been helpful to you. I've thought about this for a long time. I've written essays about it, and I think I understand it a little bit. Thanks for listening.